Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets tank is in full swing. Kevin Durant makes another return to Barclays Center, and the trade rumors continue to swirl. I'll touch on all that and more after the theme music. What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Bleav in Nets podcast and the Bleav Podcast Network. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. And if you do not already, go subscribe to Bleav in Nets wherever you get your podcasts. Most importantly, hit up my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Like this video, comment, subscribe if you enjoy my content. Anything you can do to engage is really appreciated. But on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the sad or happy state of the Nets, however you view the situation, with the tank being in full swing. We'll also touch on Kevin Durant's return to Barclays Center. Had some comments. I got to talk to him for a little bit. And we'll talk about some trade rumors. We are now 2 weeks out from the deadline, so some rumbling surrounding Cam Johnson and other players on the net. But right off the bat, the state of the Nets, it is an interesting one. There was obviously some concerns early this season. The team wins 9 of its first 20 games. Are they tanking? What direction is this going? Are they potentially going to try to go for the play-in or the playoffs, dare I say? All the worries, they've been dispelled over the last 2 or 3 weeks. It is now. The Nets have lost 13 of their last 15 games. They dropped one last night, 108-84 to the Phoenix Suns in a game where they had 9 players available, nearly all of which were minimums or two-ways, which has become, not a rare occurrence during this cold stretch. The best players on this team, which are few and far between, are not playing a lot. And it's just been a strategy that is pretty clear. The guys have injuries, but it's been evident the direction that this is heading. As I said, 2-13 over their last 15 games. They are 29th in offense and 27th in defense during that span. Obviously, we know Cam Thomas has been out with the hamstring injury after re-aggravating that during a January 2nd win in Milwaukee. But when you look at the other impact guys on this team, D'Angelo Russell, Cam Johnson, Ben Simmons, the lead ball handlers and offensive drivers, they haven't been playing that much. You talk about over these last 15 games, D'Angelo Russell's played in 7. Cam Johnson and Ben Simmons have played in 6. So what you've really seen is a commitment amongst the front office, the organization as a whole, to this tank. And this tank is really full speed ahead at this point. Like, they are committing to it during the second half of this season. And none of that is to say these guys that I mentioned, D'Lo, Cam Johnson, Ben Simmons, Cam Thomas is obviously hurt, but none of these guys, it's not to say these guys aren't actually hurt. But as I've said in the past, the way I would describe it is, if there's any nick or any knack, these guys are not going to play. They're going to be ultra cautious and hold guys out. And that's really been what it is. Games where the Nets have, multiple ball handlers, Ben Simmons and D'Angelo Russell, or they're both of those guys and Cam Johnson available. There just haven't been games like that. The one that we saw recently was the game against Portland, where the Nets scored, I think it was 134 points. They had their best offensive game of the season. So when the Nets are at full strength, when they have all of their guys, they are nowhere near one of the worst teams in the league. They're bad, but they are pretty average, I would say, or they're not nowhere near the worst team in the league. But when all these guys are out, obviously, when you have no point guards or no ball handlers, offense is going to be really difficult to come by. It's going to bleed into your defense, and you're just not going to play good basketball. And that has been, what has been happening over these last 15 games. So if we take a look at where the Nets are at in the lottery standings, amidst this cold stretch, they've now moved into 6th. They've created some separation in front of the Portland Trailblazers for 7th. They're 2 games ahead of Portland. They're a half game behind Charlotte for 5th, and they're 1.5 games behind New Orleans for 4th. Two games behind Toronto for 3rd. So 4th in the lottery standings feels like a realistic goal here, because you look at the 2 teams ahead of them. It's New Orleans and Charlotte, and New Orleans has Zion Williamson back. They're 7-3 over their last 10 games. They're clearly trying to win, even though this season is pretty much done for them. They're still trying to salvage something and see what they have moving forward. So it should not be difficult to get ahead of them. And then you look at Charlotte, who is bad, undoubtedly, but they still have far more talent than the Nets, obviously, with LaMelo Ball, with Miles Bridges, with, Brandon Miller can come back from his injury. They have more talent. So if you can get ahead of New Orleans and you can get ahead of Charlotte and you can get into that 4th slot, that's a big deal, because your odds in that 4th spot go from 37.2% in sixth to 48.1% in fourth. The odds for the number one pick go from 9% to 12.5%. And that might not sound like a lot, but that is a very, very big difference when you're talking about trying to maximize your shots at getting a top selection of one of these guys like Cooper Flagg, like Dylan Harper, like whoever is going to separate themselves in that 3 spot. So that's a really big deal. And that 4th seed or that 4th spot in the lottery standings sounds very attainable based on the way that things are trending and the way that the Nets are handling some of these injuries and the way that they could potentially proceed ahead of the trade deadline with some more moves. So, the biggest takeaway, obviously, over this last month with the trade of Dennis Schroeder, with the trade of Dorian Finney-Smith, and now with how the Nets are handling injuries to a lot of these different guys is that the tank is on. There's no doubting it. There's a commitment to it. And for the latter half of the season, people have been worried, understandably, based off, how things started, but people are still worried. Some that I see, on social media, some people that I've talked to about, they still have Cam Johnson. They still have Ben Simmons. They still have D'Angelo Russell. They still have Cam Thomas. As I said, when healthy, that's too much talent. Well, what I would say and what I have said to people who have brought that up is, there could be moves made at the trade deadline that look to, get rid of a guy potentially like Cam Johnson, who's one of the hottest targets on the trade market. And then also, if you talk about moving forward, the way that they're going to handle this, they might have to hold guys out, on a semi-nightly basis, with whatever injuries, rest, load management, whatever. Like, that's not an issue for Ben Simmons, D'Angelo Russell, Cam Thomas. I think they'll bring back really cautiously from that hamstring injury. But the bottom line is that they're going to find a way to put themselves in a position to get this pick, to get higher in those odds and get into that 4th spot, potentially even higher. And, based on how they've handled this over the last however many games, I feel pretty confident in that. So they will find a way, whether that's trades, whether that's holding guys out. The direction that this is trending is very clear. So that's what I would say about that. Before I get into some of the trade speculation, wanted to touch on Kevin Durant's return to Barclays Center last night. This was his 2nd game since being traded to the Suns. We're almost 2 years removed from that trade now, which is crazy. That was my first year on the beat. Kevin gets traded at, 2, 3 in the morning. I was up all night that night. It was a crazy few work days, after that. And we're 2 years removed by it. And time is just flying by. But KD returns. The Suns blow out the Nets, who, as I said, only have 9 available players, none of which are their top players. And, Kevin Durant does his thing. He scores 24 points, has 8 rebounds, 8 of 15 shooting, 4 of 6 from 3, his normal efficient self, and the Suns run away with the game. But, KD talked to reporters before and after the game. I had a chance to speak with him, and this has been a recurring theme from KD since the trade. He had comments right after the trade, and then he was recently on, I think it's the Out the Mud podcast, and he was talking about his time in Brooklyn, and he was, remembering it very fondly and saying things about how much he liked playing there, and said, Brooklyn was effing with me, word I'm not going to say on here. I don't like to curse for any kids that are watching, but, he has made it clear the way that he feels about the Nets, and I got to talk to him after this game last night and got to ask him several questions. And he made it clear again. I mean, the way that he talks about the Nets, it's really interesting. He said Barclays Center is his favorite arena. And then he kind of backtracked right after and said it's second behind Footprint Center, but said he loves playing in New York. He loves the fans. He likes the way that everybody appreciates basketball, whether he's on the Nets or whether he's coming back as an opposing player. He also, gave a pretty heartfelt quote when I asked him if he had any regrets or any takeaways from his time with the Nets that he's carrying into his latter stage of his career. And he said, I don't feel like I have one regret or one takeaway, but, the thing I would say, it was just how much I enjoyed my time here. And he said, the quote that stood out was, "This was the best time that I had playing basketball in a long time." And the way that he talks about it, I think to some people it wouldn't be surprising, but to a lot of people, I think it would be, because it was obviously, not a smooth ride, and a lot of things went wrong, and there was not a lot of success, at least from a playoff standpoint. So I think with all the dysfunction, with all the chaos, it might be a little weird for people to hear Kevin Durant talk about the organization this way. And, not that he doesn't need to have bad things to say about it, but I think a more neutral tone wouldn't be surprising to people, based on how this went. But the things that I would say, and when I'm looking back on it and I'm looking at it from KD's perspective, he did accomplish, a decent amount, when he was here from an individual standpoint of, obviously, the Nets didn't have the team success, but I think people forget that Kevin Durant was coming off an Achilles tear. He was, entering the second stage of his career, was not young by any means. The track record for players coming off an Achilles tear at that age was very, very not good, obviously. And there were legitimate and serious questions when Kevin Durant signed with the Nets. Will he ever be the player he was again? Will he be able to do this? He's coming off an Achilles tear. He's aging, all these things. And despite all the dysfunction, the chaos, the lack of team success, KD was able to defy expectations and come back from that Achilles tear, and he got to play after sitting out a year, and he did it at an extremely high level. And not that he ever lost his love of basketball, but he really got to get back after the most extended layoff of his basketball career to playing at an elite level and proving people wrong. I mean, if you look at his numbers, KD averaged in the 3 seasons he was here 29, 7, and 6 on above 50, 40, 90 shooting splits. So it was only like 130 appearances, but that's elite basketball. And he rose to a point, we saw it during that 2021 series against Milwaukee, where people had legitimate questions about whether he was the best player in the league. And he was able to do that here, and he was able to display that and maintain that level of play through all the dysfunction, through all the chaos, regardless of who he was playing with. I asked him if he had a favorite memory. He obviously said, the game 5 where he had the 49-point triple-double, which is, I was at that game. That was the best performance I've ever seen by a basketball player live. It was legitimately unbelievable. Like, we're talking about a different stratosphere of a guy in terms of shot making, in terms of him just levitating above everybody else. I think everybody remembers during that game, they were down 17 earlier in that game, and they came back, and Milwaukee was threatening in the final minute to, retake the lead. And James Harden was playing on one hamstring, got trapped near half court, did that thing where he kind of dribbles, the entire shot clock out almost. And he lobbed the ball to KD, who dribbled to his right to the top of the key, was guarded by Chris Middleton, and he elevated and did like almost a little bit of a double pump 3 and knocked it down to kind of seal the game. And I remember just thinking when I was watching that, like, I've never seen a player be this locked in terms of shot making, in live performance before. And that was coming off of COVID, and Barclays was going crazy, but that's a little tangent. But he said that game 5, he said, obviously the first 2 games that they won, they were up by 49 points in game 2. I was at that game also. It seemed like they were destined for a title at that point, even with James Harden being out. Just KD and Kyrie and the rest of that supporting cast was playing at such a high level. But he also said, KD and the kids, he referenced that when everybody had COVID, he was playing with rookie Cam Thomas and Kessler Edwards and David Duke. And the reason that I bring this up is Nets fans might not look at that. I think a lot do like that KD and the kids moment, but a lot of people might not look at that fondly because that team had such high expectations, and that was sort of like a gimmicky little thing. But I bring it up because to KD, I feel like it was, almost a pure on the court form of basketball that he was able to play, and he really enjoyed. And when you listen to KD talk, he doesn't like to, get involved, or not get involved, but he doesn't like to reference or, give credence to the dysfunction, all the things that happen behind the scene. That might be because he played somewhat of a role in it or a significant role in it, but he likes to keep it on the court. And I think that that's in line, obviously, with his personality. Like, he is one of the bigger hoop heads that you're ever going to see. And the things that he was able to do on the court, whether from an individual or whether from some of those, team moments that he was able to, elevate the rest of the players that he was playing with, I think that really did resonate with him, and he really did enjoy that. On top of being in the New York market and all of those things, we know that he loves playing in front of a crowd. And, while it's not MSG, I think he enjoyed the New York form of basketball. That's what he said when I asked him about, why is Barclays your favorite arena or your second favorite arena? He said, you can just tell that New Yorkers appreciate basketball. And I feel like it's at a different level than some of the other fan bases who don't enjoy it as much as I think they should or appreciate it. So he really does, I feel like a lot of this is genuine. Like, I'm obviously, if you gave him truth serum, he has his gripes about how things went. I'm sure he has some mistakes he made himself in decision making, some mistakes the organization made, some mistakes his co-star made, obviously. But I do think he has an appreciation for what happened on the court. Having said that, it is, for some fans, a lot of people appreciate it. Like, I posted these interview clips, and a lot of people were happy to hear him say these things, and they remember it fondly and all these things. I think there's another subset of fans that might see it and like throw up in their mouth a little bit and say that, oh, like, this is like so phony. This guy requested 2 trades. He asked that the head coach and the GM be fired. He did all these things. And look, if that's your opinion, I'm not gonna I'm not going to say that you're wrong or have any gripes, because I did live through all this partially as a full-time reporter covering the team. It was only the last season that he was there, but it is still somewhat strange for me to hear all of this positivity when you just think back on what the team and what the fans went through. And that doesn't mean, as I said before, it doesn't mean that KD has to bash the team, but he's going above, to be very positive about the experience here. And as I said, I think it's genuine. But when you look at the track record of things that happened when, KD came here, he wanted Kyrie, obviously. He wanted DeAndre Jordan. He got that. There's been reporting about, the involvement and the role that KD and Kyrie had in Kenny Atkinson's firing, who obviously has gone on to be a very good coach. Then KD supposedly wanted James Harden and played a role in that decision. And then it all came crashing down. Kyrie as the co-star, Harden as the last piece, Steve Nash as the coach taking over for Kenny Atkinson. It all turned into a disaster. And obviously COVID played a massive role in that. It was just this black swan event that, KD had no control over. People will argue, Kyrie didn't want to get vaccinated. Like, who are we to tell him that's right or wrong? Bottom line is, it resulted in him not being on the court. It resulted in Harden getting annoyed and not motivated, obviously. It led to him asking out. Kyrie follows. KD follows. They're saddled with this Ben Simmons contract. I don't think KD ever thought they had a chance to win with that, despite the success they had during that 2022-23 season. So KD wanted all these things, and I'm not saying it was fully him, but I think it's pretty clear that he played a large role in all of these decisions, and it all blew up in his face and in the Nets organization's face. And once it did, he asked out. So, however you want to remember it, I'm just saying it's interesting to hear him be so positive about it. I'm not saying that that's right. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm not saying if you're a fan who's happy about it, if you're a fan who thinks it's gross, I'm not saying you're right or you're wrong. I'm just saying it's interesting. And I think that his tenure and the way that it played out and his relationship with Nets fans, because he's unquestionably the best player to ever put on a Nets uniform. He's going to finish probably as a top 10 player all time. He was with the Nets during a significant portion, a prime years of his career. And there's really not a lot of other players you can say that for. So it's interesting in that sense. But I do think that in the end, a big reason why, in terms of the basketball purist in him and what he was able to do on the court here from an individual standpoint, I do think there's also a big part of him that the Nets did do right by him in the end. And at that trade deadline, while he didn't formally request a trade, it was known that he wanted to go to Phoenix and he wanted to play with Devin Booker. And that was a situation that he felt good about. And the Nets didn't do it in the offseason. They held out, but ultimately they moved on from him and they gave him what he wanted and they did right by him. And I would not be surprised if there was an understanding of, you do this for me and I will speak well about the organization and I will paint you guys in a good light. And I think that's what happened, and I think that the Nets are not, they're not in a bad situation resulting from it. I mean, KD signed that extension. Harden and Kyrie did not. And if you look at the return of what the Nets ended up getting for KD, all in all, it's like 9 first-round picks, 2 swaps, 3 second-round picks. They'll add to it with whatever they get for Cam Johnson in a trade. They're now set up with the most draft picks in the NBA over the next 7 years, most first-round picks. They have 15. They have this, $60, $70 million in cap space next summer. Only team to have that. They got their lottery picks back. So they're in a good position. KD's moved on. He hasn't had the team success that he was hoping for in Phoenix, obviously, but him coming back and reminiscing on this stuff, I think it's enjoyable for some Nets fans. It might be nauseating for some Nets fans. And for a player who is the best player to ever put on a Nets uniform, I think that juxtaposition and that, that gap in how people feel about him and the overall story of how it all played out is pretty fascinating. So that's really all I took from that and all I wanted to say. But an interesting night with KD coming back and having a lot to say about the Nets. Going to round this out with just some trade talk, trade speculation. As I said, we are 2 weeks out from the deadline. Exactly. Today is Thursday and the trade deadline 2 weeks from now. And, speculation, rumors, things are starting to pick up. And obviously Cam Johnson, based on how he has played, he is one of the best wings in the NBA this season. He's having the best season of his career by far, 19 points per game, 50, 40, 90, shooting splits. He is one of the most sought-after players in the NBA. And based on the Nets rebuilding situation and what they just did with Dennis Schroeder and Dorian Finney-Smith, there's understandably a ton of speculation about where he could end up and the teams that could potentially go after him to try to give themselves a jolt as we approach this stretch run leading up to the playoffs. And right now, the Kings, Pacers, and Grizzlies, I think, have been the teams that have most frequently been mentioned with Cam Johnson. That does not mean at all that other teams won't be in the mix. There's the way that I would put it is some other teams might not be in the mix right now, but the Nets are, known to be tight-lipped around the trade deadline. That's the way that they operate. And, there are other teams that he would be a seamless fit on. He's a guy who is a player that doesn't need things crafted around him. He kind of fits into the situation based on his skill set as a catch and shoot guy, a spot up guy, or a movement shooter, and being an adequate wing defender. It's a skill set that fits into most teams. So because of that, I said the Kings, Pacers, Grizzlies most frequently mentioned, but I do think that there are other teams that could very well be in on this, even if it's not public information right now. The Kings have been the team that a lot of people have pointed to, and there has been some reporting that they're the most aggressive and serious, and they could put together the most aggressive package to try to get him. And it's an interesting situation. I said earlier in the season, I didn't see it for the Kings. I didn't think they'd be in position to be giving up unprotected future draft picks, which is what the Nets are going to want, or that and a young player for Cam Thomas based on how their season was going. I didn't think it would be a smart move. They obviously, fired their head coach, and they've had some new success under Doug Christie, the interim. They're one of the hotter teams in the NBA over the last few weeks, and it looks like they're trying to make a move. I don't think it's a wise move for them, and because of that, I think if the Nets can get a future, unprotected first-round pick from the Kings, I think that could be a very good situation for them to get themselves in. But despite all that speculation, we had Mark Stein come out yesterday and report that the Nets and the Kings haven't had dialogue on Johnson in weeks. And that is going against what some other people have said. But that's a report from Stein. And obviously he's a very plugged in guy, but they are a team that people think makes sense for them. Now, everything that I have heard about Cam Johnson and everything I continue to hear is that the Nets are asking for multiple first-round picks for him. I've heard that from several people throughout the league, and it has been messaging continuously for the last several weeks, if not months. Or they're looking for the equivalent of 2 first-round picks, which means it could be a first-round pick and it could be a younger asset, a younger player, whatever. You get what I'm saying. It's basically the equivalent of those 2 first-round picks. So the bottom line is all the teams that I mentioned above, plus several more throughout the league, have the ability to offer that without, breaking up cores. It's a player that should be attainable for a lot of people. So, the messaging that the Nets are putting out to the league on top of that asking price is that they don't have to trade Johnson. And, leading up to the trade deadline, a lot of people would probably say that asking price of multiple first-round picks, them saying they don't have to trade him, they'd call that posturing, which a lot of teams are doing right now. This is a posturing time, 2 weeks out from the trade deadline. Once we get like a week out, a few days out, that's when things really start to pick up and you see what teams are serious about. But to people who are saying the Nets saying they don't have to move Cam Johnson as posturing, I would say that Sean Marks has damn well shown that he is willing to hold players past what some people might obviously think is wise. He did that with Dorian Finney-Smith, obviously. He did that with Mikal Bridges, ended up getting rewarded for it on the Bridges end, not so much on the Finney-Smith end, but he has shown he's willing to do this. I remember this time last year, maybe a little before this, in maybe December of last year when Dorian Finney-Smith was playing well, and we were talking about people that they could sell off given they had just, they're moving in this direction. And I spoke to a respected NBA voice who said that he thought it would be batshit crazy if DFS was on the team past the trade deadline last year. And guess what? We passed the trade deadline and DFS was still on the team. And a lot of people were shocked, including me. I was surprised that the Nets held on to him, and they ended up losing out on some value because of it. They could have traded Dorian Finney-Smith at the trade deadline in 2023 when they got him for far more than what they ended up giving him up for. But you look at the Mikal Bridges deal, you look at the Kevin Durant deal, those are bigger leverage deals that Sean Marks held on to guys longer than some people expected, and he ended up getting rewarded for it. So the reason that I say all of this is that it has been established that Sean Marks, if he does not get a deal he likes, he will hold on to guys. The trades that he's made where people have thought the return wasn't great, I would say, obviously, like Royce O'Neal, Dorian Finney-Smith, like they were fine returns, but people thought they could have gotten more if he traded them earlier. He had to trade those guys. Dennis Schroeder, same thing. Those guys were expiring contracts. And we got to a point where he had held them pretty much as long as he could. You look at Cam Johnson, he has 2 years left on his contract after this year. So Sean does not have to trade him. Now, I have said that I think that Sean should trade him at this deadline because he's playing the best basketball of his career. He's a guy that gets hurt a lot. We're seeing it right now. He's battling this nagging ankle injury that he hurt initially in November. He re-injured it during that win over the Bucks on January 2nd. And since then, he tweaked it in the game against Portland and he tweaked it against the Knicks on Tuesday. And we don't know how long he's going to be out now. It could be, based on this being the second tweak of it after he re-injured it, I would think that they'll be very cautious in the way they approach it and that he might have played his last game in a Nets uniform. If the Nets do decide to move him, at the deadline, I would not be surprising to me at all if he was held out until the deadline. But the reason I say that is, as I said, playing the best basketball of his career and a guy who has been injury prone in the past, I'm not sure if the value is ever going to be higher than it is right now. And, the way that Sean or the way that the Nets front office would probably, or the way that I know that they are, giving off the message to other teams is that, hey, he has 2 years left on his contract. If we want to, pivot to being competitive and we make a competitive move this summer, he's a guy that star players would love to play with. So that's kind of been the messaging. It's a similar messaging to what, the messaging was about Mikal Bridges, last season when all of the trade talk was happening. But the real question for me with Cam Johnson would be if they hold him past this trade deadline, how does the value, how does it differ this offseason? Some people say it's easier to trade in the offseason than it is at the trade deadline. But right now, the way that I see it, and the way I've talked to other people, and I know other people throughout the league see it as well, is that in the offseason, a lot of people are prioritizing bigger moves. Like moves like this aren't exactly a focus. When you look at right now, the trade deadline, like who is the name that you keep hearing about? It's Cam Johnson. Who's the best player, that's going to be available? Like, if you want to talk about Jimmy Butler or whatever, like that's a different conversation. But like Cam Johnson is the name. He's a commodity right now. So in my opinion, I think that this is the time to move him. I think that there will be several teams, in on him. It depends on how high the Nets set the asking price and whether that's actually what they're going to hold out for or whether they're posturing a little bit, as I said. So, it'll be interesting to see how they handle this. But Sean Marks has shown a willingness to hold on to guys, obviously, and he's Cam Johnson is a guy that they don't have to trade, as I said, for numerous reasons. So there's also, last thing I want to touch on, the conversation of obviously how that impacts the tank. If they hold Cam Johnson past the trade deadline, they still have half the season left. And he's a guy that when he doesn't play, they're 0-10. When he does play, they're on like a 34-win pace. So it's a big difference. Now, can you hold him out of games as they have? Obviously you can, but when we're talking about, that's fine when we're talking about over, a few weeks, like leading up to the trade deadline. When we're talking about the second half of the season and 2 or 3 months, he's going to have to play some. And if he's going to have to play some, and Ben Simmons is going to have to play some, and D'Angelo Russell is going to have to play some, and Cam Thomas is going to have to play some, that could get to a point where you have just too many guys available that you can't hold out every night. Well, the Nets might win a few more games than they would otherwise. So I do think that, in my opinion, there's an incentive to trade him because he's a commodity right now. I don't think there's a lot of other people available on the market that have, done what he's done this season and who could impact the team the way that he can during a stretch run. And there's also the conversation of holding him. How much could that potentially hurt the tank if, you can't hold him out every game, obviously, during the second half of this season. So that's kind of where things lie with Cam Johnson. That's where things lie with the tank. We got some KD talk in there. So that does it for this episode of Bleav in Nets. I really hope you guys enjoyed the episode and everything that I had to, input about the situation the Nets are in. As I said at the top, if you don't already, subscribe to Bleav in Nets wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Hit up my YouTube channel, Erik Slater NBA. Like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. You can find all my work on ClutchPoints.com, constant news, updates, analysis, articles every day there, multiple articles. Follow me on Twitter at Erik Slater _, live game tweets, highlights, interview clips, all of that every day. So hit me up on there. But coming up to the trade deadline, a lot of interesting things going on. Obviously, the Nets getting serious about their tank, and we'll have a daily monitor of those standings for the rest of the year. I'll have coverage of all that and more here on Bleav in Nets. Talk to you guys soon.